1983, not much was known about Iran's efforts to train and arm the radical proxies and to kill Americans and to kill our partners and our allies. But people know now. In fact, only a few years earlier, Ayatollah Khomeini led a violent radical revolution in Iran. Khomeini's regime introduced himself to the world by taking American diplomats hostage for 444 days. 444 days. We all remember when that happened. And that was something unprecedented. And it was all tied into Khomeini. Of course, he uses other people. It's kind of, and nothing's changed since that time. Nonetheless, for the next decade until his death in 1989, Khomeini was the ruthless face of an Iranian regime that applied a brutal version of religious law, murdered innocent people, suppressed religious and ethnic minorities, and supported radical Islamism. He hated Western value, and he hated the freedoms that we enjoy. And they still do. Almost 4 years into this rule as supreme leader, on October 23rd, 1983, 241 Americans, both U.S. Marines and other service personnel serving a peace mission in Beirut, were attacked at their barracks by a truck that was carrying 2,000 pounds of explosives by terrorists who were armed and trained by Iran. That was 1983. 241 died. Now, these terrorists later became what we knew as Hezbollah. That's the first time they surfaced and are identified as they are today as an arm of Iran. So Hezbollah struck. And in 2003, 20 years after the attack on our Marines, the United States District Court for the District of Columbia ruled in a civil suit brought by the victims, the families of the victims, of the 241 who were killed, that Iran had used Hezbollah as a proxy to bomb the Marine barracks in Beirut on that October day. And not much has changed with Iran. Unfortunately, that's the same thing, the way they operate now. They don't play by the rules. They never have. They are terrorists. They're worse than terrorists because they're the ones who are training the terrorists. There are that became even more apparent back when we began to learn more about their ties to Islamist terror organizations and how they use proxy organizations with no true allegiance, but on behalf of a twisted interpretation of Islamic religious texts to murder, then sneak back into the shadows. That's the way they operated. That's the way they operate today. Now, it happened under Ayatollah Khomeini, and it happens under the current supreme leader as well. So nothing's really changed. It's a lot of years have gone by. A lot of people have died. As I speak here on the floor, Iran is providing weapons and cover for the Houthi rebels who are committing unthinkable atrocities in Yemen. They've continued to support terrorist groups that threaten our personnel in Iraq. They've repeatedly attacked our partners across the region. Now, what's even worse is they seek a nuclear weapon capability, and President Obama's Iran deal would have ultimately let them have exactly what they wanted. Fortunately, we now have a president who takes a strong stance against Iran, imposing sanctions and pulling out of the flawed Iran nuclear deal that the previous administration put us in. And by the way, I had a joyful conversation yesterday for half an hour with Netanyahu. And he was reminding me that I was in Israel, and he's the prime minister, and I was in the prime minister's office at the very moment that our President Trump pulled out of the Iran deal. And I've never seen him so jubilant. We just talked about that yesterday. Now, we go back now to October 23rd, 1983. 241 Americans killed by an Iranian-backed suicide bomber. It was a terrible day in the U.S. history, and Iran was responsible, as a U.S. court ruled in 2003. In 2003, that suit brought by the victims' families, the families of the 241 who had died, brought by the victims against Iran provided punitive and compensatory relief in the form of Iranian assets. In 2007, the district court judge awarded just over $2.5 billion to the families of the ones who were murdered in that atrocity. But our work isn't done now. You'd think that it would be, but it's not, because there's nearly $1.7 billion in laundered Iranian assets in a Luxembourg bank named Clearstream. We need to make sure that they stay there and don't get bad. I have this gnawing feeling that once something is over in Luxembourg or someplace like that, that all of a sudden you'll wake up and you find out that Iran has $1.7 billion they're not entitled to spread out terrorism throughout the world. In last year's NDAA, now the NDAA is the largest bill we do each year. Now, I chair the Defense Authorization, it's called the National Defense Authorization Act. We pass it every year. So we included language that made those assets available to the victims' families. And the president signed it. And I talked to the president. He's anxious to do this. We have one obstacle that we have to get by, and that is some activity by the Second Circuit where it's now being played out. So President Trump has been a firm leader against the aggressive Iran, and as I certainly stand with him. And that's why this is a clear opportunity to continue President Trump's maximum pressure campaign against current Iranian regime and ensure these assets do not return to Iran, where they would surely be used to help the proxy organizations such as Hezbollah. And I trust our Department of Justice to play with this, and I'm glad that we have a president who's made that a top priority to make sure that the families of those 241 victims that were killed in Beirut are going to be receiving this money as opposed to money going back. Now,